the totally removed regime in Tehran and the Chinese Communist Party. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Colby, in the unclassified NDS that, again, was just issued about a month ago, on page 11, it states, quote, "The Iran's regime is weaker and more vulnerable than it has been in decades, and that their axis of resistance is similarly devastated." For anyone who understands the English language, your department clearly, explicitly downgraded the threat that Iran poses to our nation. Yet suddenly on February 28th, just a few weeks later, that all changed. Epic Fury was launched. 6 service members have lost their lives because of, in my opinion, a gross failure of force protection. And there still is no coherent explanation of what caused the change and what is the end game. And that's why if you look at public opinion polls over the last week, across the board, there's been no rally around the flag reaction by the American public. First of all, they kind of took you at your word, and the president at his word when he said that the nuclear threat was obliterated just a few months ago. And now suddenly we're engaged in a war which, again, for a lot of people, feels very much like past experiences, which didn't end very well. I want to also, for a moment, just focus on the NDS's sort of almost insulting comments about burden sharing by our European allies in NATO. Again, when you laid out in the NDS what are the homeland security threats, what's the threats in the Western Hemisphere, there's not a word in there about the fact that Putin, even in the middle of the Ukraine war, has still been increasing his investment in its nuclear forces. General Giat from the Northern Command, when he testified this past year in 2025, when he was asked the question, again, in a public setting, what are the threats to the homeland, made it very clear that the bomber fleet sorties that the Russians have been conducting over the North Atlantic coastline, that submarine patrols, there was a port visit in Cuba, and again, there's no question that for some of us who have had the briefings, this is something that actually has been accelerating over the last few years or so. Not a mention, not a syllable in the NDS in terms of the Western Hemisphere threats that, again, you posted there. In terms of burden sharing, as the Norwegian Prime Minister pointed out to President Trump not too long ago, he stated that the Russians' nuclear arsenal is 100 kilometers from its border on the Kola Peninsula. They are the eyes and ears for the United States of America in terms of patrols that go in and out from that region. They invested some serious money before President Trump was president in purchasing P-8s to conduct those ASW patrols. Denmark, UK, France, Greenland, Iceland, Canada, all of them are part of the effort to protect the U.S. homeland. And again, the Premier made it very clear that arsenal is not aimed at Norway, it's aimed at us. So when is there going to be a recognition by, your NDS about the fact that really, I think probably the most existential threat to the homeland has, over the years, decades really, been a team effort with our European allies, which they have gladly contributed to, even though for them, it's not their number one closest security threat.
Well, thanks, sir. Maybe I could refer to page 12 of the document. It says Iran's leaders, although it suffered severe setbacks, it appears intent on reconstituting its conventional military forces, and Iran's leaders have also left open the possibility they will try again to obtain a nuclear weapon. I won't go much further, but obviously the threat of Iran is countenanced in here, and we talk about the burden sharing piece, but also the ability of the president to use force. And then, sir, on page 10 about Russia, the document says Russia also possesses the world's largest nuclear arsenal, which it continues to modernize and diversify, as well as undersea space and cyber capabilities that it can employ against the U.S. homeland. So, sir, obviously this is also the unclassified version, so I don't need to.
Well, I've read the classified. I've actually read the classified.
Demonstrably here.
I've read the classified version. It is radically different from the briefings that we've gotten from Northcom and EUCOM over the years.
I can't possibly agree with that.
Well, I actually think
we take those threats very seriously, sir.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you don't give credit where credit is due in terms of our allies. That again,
Our allies are
standing
making
up-
tons of progress. I saw it in Europe. We're moving out.
Again, this
We're
this
getting down to
preceded
business, sir.
Trump. Really, again, I have the
Success has many
submarine- I have the
fathers, sir.
submarine base in Groton where those patrols are happening. Again, that collaboration has been going on for
Absolutely.
many years.
We think alliances are actually important and not just symbols, sir. That's the big, the hack for what we're doing. And
Well, they do
it's
too.
working, sir.
They do too.
Indeed.
That's what's
I agree.
missing in your NDS.
It's working, sir.
Gentlemen, time's expired. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
Mr. Colby, this is going to be a nice transition from your conversation you just had, turning you to page 10, where you were just referencing on Russia. You agree that Russia is an adversary and a direct threat to the United States?
Russian military forces clearly pose a direct threat to the United States, of course, yes.
Excellent. You were just being interviewed in a publication, Foreign Policy, that was published February 2026 concerning our commitment to NATO. You acknowledged the United States is committed to NATO. It is committed to Article 5. The administration from the president on down has made that clear. You made that statement unequivocally. However, you were then asked further questions about that statement after having made the unequivocal blank statement. And quite frankly, you waffled. And I'm going to give you a chance to unwaffle. And the unwaffling is, in that blanket statement, I think you made it clear that within NATO, there are no territories within NATO that are second-class citizens. There are no territories within NATO that are not within our Article 5 commitment, correct? The Baltics, the Balkans, there are no areas in which we have a lesser commitment.
Sure, I respect that you're making those statements. What I said is we are committed to Article 5, which is enshrined in the Washington Treaty. That's what I said.
So to make it clear, so that you're waffling, which goes on page after page, since you are capable of making the blanket statement, you are capable of saying that within the blanket statement of the United States is committed to NATO, NATO the aggregate of NATO, and is committed to Article 5. You are capable in front of this committee that is committed to NATO and committed to Article 5 to acknowledge that there is no territory within NATO, that there's a second-class citizen, and there's no area within which within our national defense strategy is a lesser territory.
So what I said and what I continue to say is that Article 5 of
It's
the
a
Washington
yes or no
Treaty.
question, Mr. Colby, and a member of Congress, you have ability to say
tremendous
yes, that there is
respect. What I
no
said, sir,
lesser.
Is Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, it applies to all of NATO, of course, absolutely.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that, because you didn't have to go on and to continue, which is what everybody's struggling with here. And I want to just say, I want to agree with the chairman. What's been so difficult, and which is really kind of gross sitting here listening to you, is the chairman has said he feels like you're dishonest, right? And you have been so disingenuous. Every time you answer a question, you feel this need to just continue on in these clarifications that are really very unnecessary. And that this clarifications that you give make us all concerned about your commitment to the truth. And I want to give you some of those clarifications that make me uncertain and really very concerned about the policy making within the department. You talk about the Trump administration when people ask you questions about the president's decision making. When we're asking about President Trump, you redefine it as the Trump administration. You say our decisions are aligned with the president, as if you're reinterpreting the president's decision-making. I want to know about the president's decision-making, not you being your interpretation about being aligned. So tell me you're not trying to make decisions where you're just divining an alignment with the president and interpretation that President Trump is the one making decisions, because up here, we're losing confidence as to whether or not Mr. Colby's going into a room and trying to decide whether or not he's aligned with the president or whether or not President Trump's making decisions, because we're all comfortable with Mr. Trump's and President Trump's decision. We're not comfortable with Mr. Colby's.
Well, sir, a couple things. First of all, I make a point of being truthful, so I categorically reject your characterization, but I'm happy to answer your questions
Well, it
here.
was the chairman,
Otherwise,
and you didn't reject it when he was straight
well,
up telling you that he had
I am
conversations with you and was very concerned about what you'd said to him and then what had happened.
I believe I'm just making the point in general. We make it very much our business. Part of being truthful is I give you a sense of what I know and what I don't know. I can't speak. I'm often, the secretary is the one who's primarily over in the White House, but we make sure that we are very lined up. Secretary is with the
You
president
said it
all the
again,
time.
lined up,
And
lined up.
we get.
I want you to make certain that the
I'm definitely
decision-making
in line
is
with the
President
and I'm a
Trump.
loyal lieutenant of the president, Mr. Turner. I can assert that absolutely.
Well, we are very, very concerned in this committee that that is not necessarily happening at times, and that's what we try to assert, and what we try to make certain happens. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mike, for bringing very serious clarity to this issue. So I think where we're going here is instead of saying the administration, we're going to start saying the president. So the very first page of the president's national defense strategy states that the department will no longer, quote, be distracted by